Jambo, Karibu, welcome to the Accountability on African SRHR Instruments. This is our curriculum for an online course. It is brought to you by Accountability International, the AIDS Foundation South Africa, and the Sex Rights Africa Network. Today, we will be examining accountability literacy. Our goals are to learn and understand what accountability is, and to be able to explain the various types of accountability. We'll also hopefully recognize what mechanisms can be used to get accountability. All this will be around 1 hour. So let's start. What is accountability? Accountability is a general principle that refers to the relationship between the government and the governed in a democracy. It is a governance principle that is fundamental to representative democracy. That is, where politicians are elected into government to take collectively binding decisions on behalf of citizens. It is a fundamental principle because it gives meaning to the notion of limited government. We elect governments to take binding decisions, but it is not allowed to take any kind of decisions in whatever way it chooses because the Constitution restricts the scope of its power as well as defines the process for taking legitimate decisions. But there is also a more political approach to accountability, which is when government is held accountable for not following and realizing the political program on what it was elected. Since we elect government by choosing between parties on the basis of how they promise to improve our society, and we pay them taxes to do so, we have a right, therefore, to hold them accountable for corruption or of those resources and for spending them differently. This is the approach to accountability that is most relevant to Accountability International, since, as we say, we identify gaps between commitment and performance and hold them accountable to poor performance. The notion of accountability stems from the argument that government power is legitimate only if it is limited and conditional. The terms of those limitations and conditions will be detailed in a social contract between the sovereign and the subjects. If government abuses the powers given to it by the contract, it should be held accountable and sanctioned. Democracy adds 3 central components to the discussion. Firstly, in a democracy, each citizen is a party to the contract with the government, however powerless that person may be in real terms. Secondly, democracy introduces an additional set of restrictions on government power in the form of a Bill of Rights that applies to all citizens. For the most part, these rights specify what the government must not do, that is, violate citizens' civil and political rights. The third component that is unique to discussions on accountability in the context of democratic governance is that a government is elected to represent the people from competing parties on the basis of a program or a manifesto on how they will use their power if they get elected. There are several types of accountability. Because accountability is a complex concept with many variations that apply differently to different political contexts. In this section, we will expand on the theory somewhat by introducing distinctions between the different types of accountability. We have what you call vertical accountability, which refers to the political basis for accountability that was referred to above. It captures a power that is held by citizens in order to counter the powers held by government. The second type of accountability is called horizontal accountability. If vertical accountability is a power relation between government and the people, horizontal accountability is a power relation between different institutions and organs of the state. Then we have what we call top-down accountability. Although vertical and horizontal accountability have very different institutional designs, they both share the fundamental purposes of enforcing limits on government power. We now come to getting accountability, who and how. As can be demonstrated in the image on your right, the notion accountability jurisdiction refers back to the image of a contract between the sovereign and the subjects. It identifies the actors that legitimately can demand accountability and in what circumstances this can be done. For instance, the judiciary cannot claim accountability through the ballot box, and neither can non-citizens since they do not have the vote. An aggrieved citizen cannot directly demand accountability for having her or their civil rights trampled on. The courts must do it for her or them. Each citizen, however powerless, is part of a contract and has some power to hold their government accountable. The Bill of Rights usually forms the central core of this contract. The contract is based not only on formal rules, but also on the content of a political program or manifesto. This contract covers not just negative rights or freedom from civil and political rights, but also positive rights like rights to social-economic. Civil societies and organizations too do not hold rights as individuals do, and they cannot vote. It will be part of a political mapping analysis to determine whether the constitution in a particular country allows for civil society to make presentations to parliament and whether CSOs, organizations, can act as legal entities in relation to the judicial system. If CSOs have few legal constitutional means for demanding accountability, they can of course still act politically. The disrespect for national boundaries as barriers for legitimate activism is seen as a progressive undoing of an unequal and unfair world system of state power that keeps some countries poor and or shields corrupt and oppressive governments from accountability for abusing powers against its citizens. The concept of glocal plays an important role in that what happens in one country can trigger the same in another, and that what happens at the local level is indeed a global issue. We've now examined who can hold governments accountable. This includes citizens, civil society organizations, and globalization. We now come. Similar to the discussions on jurisdiction, global human rights activism is based on the argument that governments and others can and should be held accountable for delivering basic social-economic rights. In terms of loss of political support, governments can be voted out of office through the electoral system. We have what we call critical public opinion, where considerable loss of support for government is expressed in surveys in between elections, or what we call peer review mechanisms. This works as a means to ensuring leaders are held accountable by their peers, such as ministers of health. We come to constitutional obstruction. There are two ways in which this is manifested. One is legislative criticism, where when Parliament refuses to pass bills that will give effect to government policy, or judicial orders, like when a High Court directs government to alter either the content of policy or the process with which it is being developed and or implemented due to a conflict with legal or constitutional provisions. In terms of political campaigning, media criticism plays a big role. When investigative journalism exposes poor performance and or when government is taken to task on the editorial pages of major newspapers and other news media is a form of accountability. And of course, we've got civil activism. This involves actions and campaigns by civil society organizations that expose poor performance by government. They include naming and shaming. The other novelty is the use of political shaming at regional and international level as a sanction for poor performance. Then we also have what we call performance monitoring, which is a continuous process. But of course, it is a globalized civil society that is making the most of political shaming as a sanction for poor government's performance, especially the use of the internet. Now let us come to understanding the accountability process. How do we increase accountability? In order for accountability to become a constructive governance principle in the response to health needs, it cannot be reduced to a simplistic blame game between government and stakeholders. Accountability International explains accountability as a governance mechanism in 3 steps as depicted below. 1 is about transparency. The dialogue on accountability cannot start unless all stakeholders have access to accurate, comprehensive, up-to-date, and methodologically sound data on the status of health provisions in their country, as well as what policy, programming, and implementation is being done. 2 is dialogue. The meaningful involvement of civil society and government, supported by regional and continental structures and funding partners, is vital in order to analyze the data and determine whether performance is on track to achieve relevant commitments, goals, and targets. Of course, the third key issue is action. The accountability process does not stop at transparency and dialogue, but are steps in which, in turn, need to inform decisions taken by leaders as to which actions need to be taken to improve the health response. These actions, again, need to be monitored and transparent, bringing us full circle. Now it's time to assess yourself. Can you write a definition of accountability? Can you name the 3 types of accountability which exist according to classical governance theory? And of course, can you name 3 mechanisms that can be used to get accountability from a government? Thank you very much.